Good afternoon or morning, everybody. My name's Gabe Cohen, and I'm the Senior Director of Marketing Communications here at GuideStar. We're just going to give everyone about one more minute to log on to today's webinar, so don't mind the hold music here, and we'll be right back with everyone. All right, welcome everybody to today's webinar. As I said earlier, my name is Gabe Cohen. I'm the Senior Director of Marketing Communications here at GuideStar, and thanks for joining us for today's webinar, Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion in Philanthropy, Building the Data Infrastructure. So with that, let me start with a few housekeeping items. The first thing is that today's webinar will be recorded, but it's not being recorded on your computer. I don't know, GoToWebinar likes to throw curveballs at us, and so for whatever reason, it's telling everyone it's being recorded on their computer. It's not, but we will be sending out the recording of today's webinar via email. So no need to ask, and that will be coming to you just in the next couple of days. The second is that we do want today's webinar to be interactive. So you can use the questions pane there in GoToWebinar. And with that, ask questions throughout the presentation. We're going to save as much time as we can at the end for our three panelists. And we'll get to as many as we can at that point. Great. So with that, I am going to talk a little bit about who's on the webinar today. First, a little bit about myself. I am the Senior Director of Marketing and Communications for GuideStar. I implement and oversee strategic marketing communications to advance GuideStar's brand, broaden awareness of its programs, and increase adoption of its products across stakeholder audiences. Next up will be Kelly Brown, joining us from Chicago. Kelly is the Director of the D5 Coalition, a 5-year effort to increase philanthropy's diversity, equity, and inclusiveness. Prior to this, she was principal consultant at Viewpoint Consulting, which provides program design, planning, research, and facilitation services to nonprofits, philanthropic organizations, and individuals investing resources to strengthen underserved communities. Next up, Amanda Holm will join us from Boston. Amanda is the Manager of Nonprofit Effectiveness at Boston Foundation. Shortly after earning her BA in Government and Spanish from Harvard, Amanda began her career in the nonprofit sector, spending several years working directly with youth in the greater Boston area. She's now working to make improvements in the Massachusetts nonprofit sector through data dissemination, capacity building, and financial analysis. She's passionate about education, art, and racial justice advocacy, and serves on the board of directors for Artistic Noise and the OCD Foundation of Massachusetts. Last up, Dolores Estrada will join us from Southern California. Dolores is the Director of Grant Operations at the California Endowment. She oversees the administrative functions and policies of grant process and provides guidance on issues of document management and legal compliance review. Dolores began her career in philanthropy in 1999 and has had several positions during her time at the California Endowment. Great, so the agenda today, I'm going to start off talking a bit about how GuideStar is acting as a repository for DEI data. And then Kelly will chime in and talk a bit more about philanthropic sector overview. After that, Amanda will talk about lessons directly from the Boston Foundation. And then Dolores will do the same from the California Endowment. And then lastly, we'll talk a little bit as a group about the future of DEI and grant making. So just want to do a little bit of scene setting here before I dive into things from the GuideStar perspective. And I wanted to tell everybody that last week I had the pleasure of being at the PEAK conference down in Orlando, Florida with a group of grant makers. And it was the number one thing, DEI was the number one thing that I had foundations asking about. I was on a panel that had nothing to do with DEI, and at some point we found ourselves talking about DEI. And not only that, but I had the pleasure of listening to Kelly's plenary session with Satanya from the Annie E. Casey Foundation. And I really loved the story that Kelly told during that. So Kelly, would you tell everybody today the story about your colleague, Alex, real quick, and then we'll dive into the rest of the presentation.
Sure, Gabe. Thanks for that. And I guess I think one of the reasons why the story resonates is because we often think about data and in very sort of mechanical terms, and yet when we're talking about diversity and inclusion, it really is about who we are, and it can be difficult and challenging. And so I shared the story of a colleague who worked with me early in the D5, the Life of the D5 Coalition, who was our partner, our communications partner. He's a young gay man, and had been very helpful in helping us think strategically about the message. That we had just gone through a day-long training. We were kind of exhausted. We were having drinks in the bar afterwards and chatting. And and I kind of finally said, you know what, Alex, I know I'm in this work all the time, and I said, but I've noticed in the LGBTQ conversation that some extra letters had been added to that nomenclature, and I realized, that I really wasn't sure what they meant or what the significance was. And I said, so I just have to ask you, what are those extra letters on that you sometimes see in that phrase? And so Alex laughed, and he was very gracious, and he explained to me what they were and what they meant, and basically that a lot of these things were in contention. But he said to me, he's like, I'm really glad you asked, because most people don't. And he said, but it's really important to just ask. And he said, yeah, I like the way how vulnerable you get after you've had a drink or so. And so I share that story because we really do have to understand that a lot of this work is about sometimes leaning in and being vulnerable. It's not just about the tools and the platforms and the formats. It really is about leaning into inclusiveness.
Yeah, and Kelly, thanks so much for sharing that. I just really, that story resonated with me when I heard it, and I'm sure it does with some of our audience as well. So thank you, and we'll jump back to your part of the presentation in just a minute here. So I'm going to quickly talk about how GuideStar is acting as a repository for diversity data. And I'm going to start with this overall kind of graph, if you will, of how GuideStar operates. And very briefly, on the left-hand side, you've got inputs or data sources. On the right-hand side, you've got our users. And then in the middle, this is where we operate as a database. And then we share that information to our users, either via GuideStar.org or via one of our partners, which I'm going to talk about here. So what we're talking about today is both foundations and nonprofits over on the left-hand side, sharing that information with GuideStar in the center as a database. And then that information getting out to the world via either our website or through our partners and channels, typically via one of our APIs, which I'm going to touch on in just a little bit here. And then that information just gets out to all of our different audience members. So everyone from nonprofits to donors to foundations to researchers to beneficiaries sees that information. And it's tens of millions of users, either via GuideStar.org or via one of our partner channels, that are seeing that information. So a bit more on kind of the data behind the data, if you will. We've got information on 2.6 million organizations. About 1.6 million of them are active. We've got information on about 2 million people. Over 150,000 organizations have provided proprietary information directly to GuideStar. We have information on 250,000 faith-based organizations, and over 50,000 organizations have earned a seal of transparency on GuideStar, so we're very proud of that. GuideStar data comes from all different places. I mentioned that it can come from nonprofits themselves, but also directly from the IRS, from your 990s, or from the Department of Treasury's OFAC. All sorts of different sources are coming to GuideStar. But what we want to highlight today is the fact that this information can be updated by nonprofits themselves. You can come and claim your profile on GuideStar, just like you would claim your personal profile on LinkedIn and update information about your organization. Most importantly, to today's topic, we're talking about updating the diversity information about your organization. So why should we do that? Well, it's going to help us understand who we are, both as individual organizations and as a sector. And then from that, we can evaluate the impact of the work that we're having, and we can increase the will of nonprofits to advance DEI issues, foster better relationships, and then just lead the sector toward greater equity overall. We collect different types of demographic information on organizations, and whether you're a foundation or a nonprofit, you can come and update this information for your own organization. And we do that on 3 different levels: for boards, for full-time staff, and for part-time staff, along the lines of gender equity, race and ethnicity, sexual orientation, and disability status. And then for the organization, we also collect kind of diversity strategy information. So here's how that information ends up looking for the diversity data that we collect about your organization. And you can see that it's displayed in what we hope are easily to understand and digestible graphs that talk about these different categories. And then quickly, here's how that diversity strategy information shows up. So with that, we want to do a couple of polls today. So this first one is going to be for foundations only. So if you're a foundation member, we had about 200 foundation participants registered for today's webinar. So please go ahead and answer this poll. Again, only if you're a foundation participant. And we want you to select all that apply. And this is talking about diversity data that you collect for your grantees, not about your own organization, but for your grantees. Do you collect along the lines of gender identity, or race and ethnicity, or sexual orientation, or disability status, or population served? So just one more second here. We're going to let some responses trickle in. Great. And so we can take a look at the results here. Population served, so almost everybody's collecting population served. That's great. And then some gender identity, a lot on race and ethnicity, some sexual orientation and disability status. Excellent. So we're going to move on to our next poll question now. And this is just for the nonprofits in the audience today. We had about 600 nonprofits registered today. So if you are a nonprofit, we want to know about your own organization. What are you collecting for your own organization? And again, it's those same categories of gender identity, race and ethnicity, sexual orientation, disability status, and population served. So we'll just give it one more minute here. Great. And pretty similar results. Yeah, that's I'd say the number one thing that stands out to me there is how similar these results are. So thank you, everybody. And then just to talk a bit about what we've collected on GuideStar already. So over 9,000 organizations have shared demographic information. You can see there the breakdown. Some have done one category or multiple different categories. We've had over 6,000 organizations share diversity practices, over 300 funders that have shared that information. Something that's kind of a highlight here is that 55% of organizations report a strong representation of women in leadership. That's fantastic. And only about 6% of orgs that have supplied information on their boards are composed of majority people of color. So obviously an area of improvement. Great. So very quickly, what you can do. So the number one thing that we'll want you to do is at the end of this webinar, we're going to send out a link to our brand new DEI page here on GuideStar where you can find more information. But as a foundation, come to that page and learn more about how you can lead by example. You can encourage your grantees to update their information, or you can talk to GuideStar about investing in our work. There's a lot that we want to continue to work on over the next couple of years, and we'd love to have those conversations. As a nonprofit, make sure you're claiming your profile on GuideStar. That's guidestar.org/update is the easiest way to do that. And then you can also learn more about the different options for you by going to that same page. It's learn.guidestar.org/DEI, and that's where you can learn more. Very, very briefly, I did want to mention that our new APIs let this information get out to other databases all over the internet. And anyone can take this information and then ingest it into your platforms, into your applications. And so you can get that diversity information that GuideStar collects and just build it right into your own databases. Also, one quick note that I'm lucky enough to be on GuideStar's equity team, which we call the GET here. And what GuideStar is trying to do is make sure that we're looking internally at the same time that we're looking externally. And we want to ensure that we grow in practice, policy, and culture regarding issues of DEI. And so for the last 6 months or so, I've been working with 15 of my teammates to help improve our internal issues as well. And I'm sure many of you here today are either from these organizations, these different partners that we have, or are members of these different organizations, but we're not doing this alone. Beyond Kelly, Amanda, and Dolores' groups that we're working with lots of other organizations on this issue. So lots of great resources out there from organizations beyond GuideStar. With that, Kelly, I want to turn it over to you.
Okay, thanks, Gabe, so much for that that overview. It's a really important element, I think, of really making it feasible and possible and accessible for people to collect and share, and most importantly, use this data. And then we worked obviously closely with GuideStar over the years and a lot of those other partners. But Gabe mentioned that I was formerly the director of the D5 Coalition, which is the next slide. And you can see the, or beyond this, the next slide. The D5 Coalition was a 5-year effort, as Gabe mentioned, to really strengthen philanthropy's capacity around diversity, equity, and inclusion. And it built on a lot of many years of work and leadership and conversation in the field of philanthropy around these issues. But the effort was really trying to sort of move this conversation into the mainstream of the field, and to really think about some concrete ways that we could think about moving the needle. And, you know, our goals were looking at, you know, affecting the leadership of foundations, making them more representative and inclusive, increasing funding for diverse communities, and ensuring that everyone had access, equal access to foundation resources, improving the data collection and transparency capacity of the field so that we could know what was going on, and also to identify and share best practices around how foundations were taking this up internally in terms of their, you know, their own makeup and their own grant making. And interestingly, what we found was that as we started to execute strategies on a lot of these different goals, but we realized that we couldn't really measure progress on the other goals unless we really strengthened the data collection capacity. And some of you may know, prior to D5, immediately prior to D5, there was a conversation in the field of philanthropy around that centered around pressuring foundations to really collect and share this data, that I think was in part a catalyst for the field to really understanding that it really needed to get better at this. And so, so while we had a range of goals, we did really start to lean into the data collection so that people had the tools and capacities. So next. Next slide. So when as part of the effort, about midway through, we've got the opportunity, kind of serendipitously, to work with GuideStar and at that point in time, Green 2.0, to really make this data collection capacity possible. Even though we worked with, as Gabe mentioned, many other partners, the Foundation Center, Data Arts, other data aggregators, and a lot of that effort really strengthened our capacity to understand what were the real barriers to collecting this data, what were people already doing, how could we actually make it easier and more feasible for folks to get a better understanding of what was the human capital within the nonprofit and foundation sector, and who were the communities that folks are really serving. So we, as Gabe mentioned, work closely to help them develop the profile, and even in the short time that that was launched, it has really come a long way in terms of improving and strengthening that tool as a resource. Next slide. So in addition to our work with GuideStar, since the D5 Coalition has sunset, I started to work with Peak Grant Making on a research project to go deeper into what were foundations already collecting and how were they using it. Again, the role of grants management is important because they sit right at the cusp of sort of data and programming. And so Peak was uniquely positioned to poll its members on what kind of data were they collecting, and what kind of data and how were they actually using it. So we reached out through the survey to their membership. We got a good response rate. We supplemented that with interviews, and it really was a broad spectrum of foundations, type, size, and geographic scope, and issue area, which was, I think, important in terms of giving us some insight into the representation of this. And based on the responses, about half of the foundations who responded were collecting demographic data, and half were not. And similar to the polls that we saw earlier, most of the data that was the kind of demographic data that was being collected was on race, ethnicity, and gender. And most of it also was on constituents served as opposed to the makeup of nonprofits themselves. Next. So what we found in terms of how foundations were using this data, most were really using it just to get a picture, just to get some insight into who they were serving and to be sure that they were serving who they intended to serve, right? Many had some kind of explicit desire around being inclusive of diverse communities, or at least reaching everyone in the communities. And many reported that the data actually helped them identify gaps in reach and scope and service. Some had explicit goals around equity and inclusion and representation, and so we're really using this to further those values. But many, what we found, were collecting this data, but really weren't using it consistently. So they were collecting it in lots of different ways, sometimes through narrative, through interviews, but also sometimes they were just collecting it and weren't using it, which is, is something we really want people to really think more closely about. Next. Some of the challenges that folks found with using this data or collecting this data was that there were so many different kinds of taxonomies and nomenclature, and that was experienced on the part of, in many cases, of nonprofits. But it was also a challenge in terms of which kind of taxonomy do you use? How do you call the categories of people? What is the current wording and rationale? And that was I think, a real challenge for a lot of folks to be sure that they get it right. Sometimes people were unclear on whether the data was accurate when they were collecting it from nonprofits. Sometimes they got pushback because people felt that if they collected this data and shared their own demographic makeup, they would be penalized from foundations because they may not appear as diverse as they ought to be, or however that is defined. Not sure how to use it, actually. What does it mean? What is the data telling us? Is it not just, does this mean that we have to change our grant making process? There was a lot of unclarity about that. And it's difficult for some kinds of programming to really understand constituency data, for example, policy advocacy work. So there are some legitimate challenges and reasons why people grapple with this issue, but it doesn't make it any less important. And I often tell people it's like my birth certificate says Negro female, but I'm pretty sure that that's not a name that you commonly hear used when referring to African Americans. But at the time, it was the verbiage at the time. And my point is to say that some of the challenges around getting it right and getting the right nomenclature, we have to understand that these things are dynamic and that they change, but that doesn't mean that we ignore them or that they don't matter. So next slide. What we also learned, and I mentioned earlier, the partnership that we had with our communications firm, was that, a lot of this work around collecting the data, demographic data, even though you will hear about lots of tools and taxonomies and what have you, it really is a question of will. People really have to be willing to engage and embrace and lean into information that can sometimes be very challenging and very charged, but it's precisely for those reasons that it's important to engage it. And what we learned, though, is that building that will really has to focus on the audience and focusing the right message for the right audience at the right time. And so if you're thinking about engaging this within your foundation, you really have to be careful, be strategic and thoughtful around how you build buy-in around collecting this data effectively and using it helpfully. The next slide. And some ways to do this, again, is to really think about, one, how can we make it easy for people to do that? And I think the tools that the field is developing now and the best practices that is surfacing in other foundations is helping to do that. Think strategically how to persuade folks to collect this data and to focus many times on the insight and that it gives folks into their impact, because we know that insight and impact are really crucial motivators for most foundations and nonprofits. Really think about who are the peers in the field that that folks respect, that they're working with, who are also collecting, that sometimes they can be learning partners and allies, but it also really helps to highlight who is also doing it. And then most importantly is to share stories of how this data actually strengthens your work, because stories of impact and mission alignment are really compelling. And then finally, next slide, it's really important, I think, to think about what I call demographic data. Other people call it diversity data. But it really is a critical piece of information that the social sector writ large, but certainly foundations and them can ignore, is because our demographics are changing. And here's a slide of the changing demographics around race and ethnicity, but that's only one element of difference. And this is an opportunity for us now to really lean into being inclusive of what our communities are and what they certainly are going to be in the future. So on that note, I'm going to turn it over to Amanda, and we're going to hear some stories of doing this in action.
Thank you so much, Kelly. And it was really interesting for me to just see right now where I fit on the bell curve in terms of the foundation. So thank you for that. Next slide, please. So hello, everybody. My name is Amanda Holm, and I work in the areas of nonprofit effectiveness and capacity building with the Boston Foundation. Before I get into our work and plans for diversity, equity, and inclusion, I'd like to share a brief overview on who we are and why this work is so important to us. So the Boston Foundation is Greater Boston's community foundation, and we serve about 80 cities and towns around Greater Boston in Massachusetts. We're one of the oldest foundations in the country. We just recently celebrated our centennial a couple of years ago. And as a community foundation, we're pretty large with about $1 billion in assets and dispersing about $116 million to the community each year. We award around 160 grants per year, totaling $16 million. And we also house several hundred donor-advised funds, which award around $100 million per year, both in Greater Boston and around the country. So as I move into our history and work, I'd like to kind of just be very transparent that we're coming from the perspective of a foundation in which, in some ways, we've always thought about DEI, but in other ways, it's pretty new for us. Over the next couple of slides, I'll walk through some of the highlights of our work in the last century, as well as how it has changed over time. So you can see here on our timeline, starting around 1915 when we were founded, Boston was one of the primary hubs for the struggle for human rights in America. And because of this, we consider diversity, equity, and inclusion to be part of our DNA as a foundation. And in fact, our core work at the foundation has always had a lens towards social justice. In the early part of the 20th century, for example, social justice looked like the fight for immigrant rights in Boston, and then taking on busing and housing during the civil rights era in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And in 1985, Anna Faith Jones became the first woman of color in the nation to lead a foundation when she took over the reins here at the Boston Foundation. Next slide, please. But really, it wasn't until the last 5 or 10 years that diversity, equity, and inclusion, and more specifically, race, became an explicit rather than implicit strategy in our programming. While we've always supported organizations that have worked on equity and social justice issues, it was only recently that we pushed to make DEI the lens through which we do all of our grant making and programming, regardless of the mission of the nonprofits we're supporting. Next slide, please. So here's a brief snapshot of what that looks like currently at the Boston Foundation. Right now, it is a program-driven approach to how we support DEI, both internally here at the foundation and externally within our local community and beyond. We recognize that one of our greatest strengths, besides our funding ability, is our voice. And by making DEI a visible priority, we can have potentially an impact on other funders and community organizations and how they do their work. While we by no means have reached our potential, we have made a good deal of progress. So internally, our program team has developed a set of action-based principles by which each of us lives. So these are seemingly simple principles that cause us to reflect on how we are bringing DEI into our everyday work. We have a team of committed individuals who ensure that these principles are prioritized as core to our work and not supplemental to it. So implementation of these principles can take on many forms. It might look like talking to a potential grantee about how they can strategically and thoughtfully expand their board to better represent the communities they serve. Or it might be the introduction of a much broader initiative, for example, that trains nonprofits on how to successfully implement diversity, equity, inclusion work into their own organizations. One of the biggest changes and challenges we're currently undergoing is a revamp of our due diligence process. This strategic update allows us to prioritize DEI in our decision-making as we award grants to the community. We plan to implement these changes in a transparent way that will signal to both nonprofits and other funders that we are really walking the walk. So if successful, this would mean a marked increase in the diversity, equity, and inclusion of the nonprofits we support. We consider this to be especially prudent now in the midst of a sector-wide leadership transition. As nonprofit founders and executives prepare to retire or move on from the sector, we have a real opportunity to influence how they're thinking of their own leadership pipeline. We are supporting these leaders and the nonprofits in a number of ways, including with a series of forums called Race to Lead, which highlights data on racial disparities in nonprofit leadership and shares specific challenges that people of color face as they ascend to leadership positions. Externally, we've also been supporting leadership pipelines in communities of color through our grassroots strategy area and our Boston Neighborhood Fellows program. These programs provide both monetary and capacity building support for nonprofit leaders of color to support their ascension up the leadership pipeline. We're also committed to engaging members of the community in our grant making decision process through a program called Collaborate Boston, which enlists community members as grant reviewers. Next slide, please. So now we get to why we're all here, this imperfect, messy, but very necessary thing called data, and very much in line with what Kelly said. We collect it. Some of us use it. Some of us don't use it as much as we would like to, but it's becoming more and more obvious just how powerful it can be when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion. So once again, I'd like to share that we are in the beginning stages of understanding our own data, learning what is most helpful to collect, how we can use it internally, and how we can share our learnings externally, all while also creating the least amount of burden on our nonprofit partners. Right now, we collect pretty minimal demographic data from our grant applicants. Right now, on the right-hand side of the screen, you can see a screenshot of the management tab of our Giving Common website. This is an online platform we use in part to collect all kinds of data from our grant applicants. We ask all of our impact area grantees to fill out a profile on this website, which includes information about their programs, finances, staff, and board. What you can see there now is the total demographic data we can currently collect on staff and board on this site. It is very limited gender and ethnicity data that has not quite caught up with the current preferred language and selection choices. Grantees are required to fill this out, but do have the option to select other for anyone they choose. In addition to this platform, we also collect data from our grantees using a quick written form that does have similar categories to the above. We know this is not sufficient, so we are working now in collaboration with GuideStar to expand the categories to include demographic data, such as gender identity, better representation of racial and ethnic identities, as well as including options for protected groups, such as those in the LGBTQ community and people with disabilities. We don't yet have an understanding of how many of our nonprofits currently collect this information, so as we move forward to better represent our nonprofits and those we serve, we want to be very aware of two things: the influence we have as a funder in moving the needle forward, and the burden we place on nonprofits who may or may not already be collecting this information. So currently, we're using our data in a couple of different ways. First is benchmarking. We use our grantee demographic data to better understand if we are supporting organizations that are more or less diverse when compared to the state and national averages. We've started doing this in the last couple of years and are now able to gauge not only how we have previously fared in terms of supporting diversity, equity, and inclusion, but we can also use the information to better understand how we can support our nonprofit partners on their own journeys. In partnership with benchmarking, we can now also more explicitly prioritize diversity, equity, inclusion as part of our decision-making process with grant making and measure our progress year over year. And then finally, planning. Now that we really have DEI as an explicit part of our programming, we have the opportunity to infuse it throughout our foundation's work as we introduce new programming and work with new stakeholders. We have opportunities and the responsibility to share our data and learnings with the community to ensure that we all keep progress moving forward. We're very excited about this phase of our work and look forward to sharing both challenges and best practices with our peers. So now I'm going to pass it over to Dolores Estrada from the California Endowment.
Thank you, Amanda. Hello, everyone. My name is Dolores Estrada, and I'm the Director of Grant Operations here at the Endowment. And I'm very happy to be here today because I want to take this time to really share what the Endowment's journey has been as it's been building its data infrastructure around demographic data. But before we start talking about the data, I want to put down the foundation for our lessons learned over the last 10 years and really how important that is in terms of getting us to the data. So about the Endowment. The Endowment was established in 1996 as a health conversion private foundation, focusing solely on the health and well-being of Californians. And since inception, the endowment has really committed itself to diversity, equity, and inclusion through the work we do, we support, and within the foundation. This commitment has been driven by the belief that DEI improves our organizational effectiveness and enriches the quality of our work and the communities that we serve. And as you can tell by the mission statement, this really documents our long-lived commitment to DEI. Words like expand, underserved, improvements, and all Californians. These are select words that articulate TCE's focus. But more importantly, it helps us then ask the questions that help us move in the direction of making sure that DEI is not just a tool or the shiny new star for philanthropy. For example, who are we expanding access to? What communities are we serving? And what types of improvements are we seeking? Our mission statement helps to share why TCE cares about DEI and how it has become central to our work. And this is also fundamentally the reason why we've endeavored to implement organizational-wide, multifaceted, comprehensive DEI efforts that help support this commitment. Next slide. As we've heard with Amanda and Kelly in terms of the foundation of these DEI conversations, really it starts with just not the data. It starts with, in the organization, fundamentally, the support that you have around being able to talk about and engage in diversity-related work and using your foundation as leverage. And that is the one thing that the endowment has in spades. From inception, this has been something that has been articulated from our board to our executive staff to everybody down below. And really what it does, it helps us not only articulate our commitment, but this authorizing environment allows us to institutionally support DEI in the day-to-day operations, not having to go to the board, because the board already believes in this commitment and has given us the opportunity and the space to continue the conversation in the way that we do our work. This authorizing environment really allows us to explore the many facets of DEI at the foundation before we even get to the data collection. Next slide, please. It has also resulted in many things that have organically developed over time. And one of them is the creation of our DEI commitment statement. It is what began the journey for the endowment in terms of the other steps that we have taken in order to create the space to be able to have DEI conversations. At the core, it allows us to be able to do a lot of the things that we're going to talk about in a few minutes. The development of our internal diversity audit is a result of this statement. So within the endowment, we do a report card on ourselves. We have goals that we've established, and meeting those goals and being able to articulate them to our community partners is an important way that we hold ourselves accountable for really serving the people that are our constituents. Next slide. It's also led to a lot of development within the organization about how we do DEI. And in the programmatic sense, we have created a lot of opportunities to have those conversations. Within the organization, we have an equity and diversity work group that has really, again, created the space for the conversations and the learnings around DEI. So understanding what intersectionality is, right? That doesn't necessarily come about easily, but it's a word in the field. And in order to be able to get to understanding it, we really needed to look about educating ourselves and then also making sure that we were providing the right tools and resources for our staff. What you see before you is one of those tools created by our equity and inclusion work group, which is really what is the lens for decision making at the macro level. This tool can also be used at the grant making level, but really when you think about DEI, it is not something that you insert into the grant making, it's something that you insert into the strategies, into the initiatives. And so this lens really allows us and gives us the freedom to be able to explore that in a way that allows us to really make the impact we want to make. The creation of this tool was developed by our programmatic staff for decision making, but it also is a connection between the other work groups within the organization that are also looking at our grant making through this equity and inclusion lens. Next slide. So now we get to the point about the data. And in order to get to the data, I have to put a little context to who it is that we're serving and the scale of our grant making and the scope of the impact of asking for the demographic data. As you can see, for the last 2 years, our total awards are close to 2,000. And really, that's a lot of organizations that we can impact. And in having those grantees have those conversations at their nonprofits, it is an amazing opportunity for us to really grow the awareness and make it meaningful for the work that we want to do. So our assets are over $3 billion, and our payout, as you can tell, is over $150 million in each year. And this is not the driving force for our data collection around demographics. It is not, but it is a way of demonstrating to you that the scale is large, there's an audience, we have an opportunity to really build up the field by having these conversations within our foundations and extending that opportunity to our nonprofit partners. Next slide. So let's talk about the journey around the data collection, because that's really what we want to talk about. How do you build that infrastructure? One of the first pieces I will say is that having that authorizing environment has let us and allowed us to make mistakes over time and take the opportunity to really think about how we want to do DEI at our foundation. In around 2010, the endowment began online grant making, and in doing so, it was given an opportunity to really think about how it was going to collect diversity data. We decided that we would have a voluntary questionnaire at the end of each application, and we would get information regarding the directors, executive, and staff of the nonprofit that was applying. And then we would store this information in our database. Unfortunately, that doesn't really give us the opportunity to share and learn globally. And so one of the big things that we discovered, next slide, is that having checkpoints when you are collecting this diversity data is really important. And in 2014, 4 years after we'd started our new 10-year initiative and our online grant making, we looked at our diversity data that we had collected and realized that we had very low responses. But more importantly, we had not articulated to our nonprofit partners how the data would be used. And so that was also an aha moment for us, as well as some of our partners didn't collect this information. So how could you ask that question if it wasn't something that they had the resources or the interest in doing? It was, again, one of those shiny objects for philanthropy. 2015, we decided that we would take a pause and start articulating the value of collecting this data to our nonprofit partners. And collection of the data is not just around widgets. It is about meaningful examples of how that data can then drive your grant making and drive the education of your own staff in the ways that really can make the impact that you want. Next slide. And so to that end, when we took the pause, our president and CEO, Dr. Robert Ross, put out a letter to our community stakeholders and shared with them what our commitment was, not only about the importance of it in our operations, but really helping the grantees understand how we were going to use it. And fundamentally, it was going to be used to help us understand how well we reflected on the needs of the communities that we served. And were we equipping our staff with the critical data that they needed in order to be able to serve those diverse communities in California? And more importantly, it was a way for the endowment to track our progress and our commitment to the board around DEI. And we have been keeping track of it through our diversity audit report, which is one of the things that I think has helped us really step back, reflect on what we're doing, and maybe course correct to the point that we now have a better sense of how we want to use our data. Next slide. So what we learned was that the why is always important. Don't assume that everybody understands the why. that collecting the database and storing the information was not the best approach for us. It didn't allow us the flexibility, and it didn't give us the opportunity to really extract the data in a way that was meaningful. But also, it gave us an opportunity to really challenge ourselves and ask our partners, what were some of the barriers or challenges? Just like Kelly mentioned, there are a lot of barriers and challenges that come up that in formulating a plan to collect the data really need to be looked at. And then lastly, one of the things that I think we all agreed on was that more important than collecting this data for our own purposes, it was really more important for the endowment to have an active role in building the field, educating and creating awareness around the subject matter, so that when we got to the data, then the data had more meaning. Next slide. So this might be an oversimplified approach to diversity, but I think it just gets to the point of having that strong authorizing environment at the board and executive levels allows for the organic appearance of the tools and resources and the conversations in the space in order for us to really learn about DEI at an organizational scale. And how do you infuse that into your grant making? And lastly, it allows you to collect that diversity data broadly and share what you learn, not just within the organization, but outside your own foundation. Next slide. And these three steps really have helped us articulate what our long-term goal is. And although we started in August of 2016, this has been an ongoing project for the endowment, is really making sure that our applicants are voluntarily completing their GuideStar diversity profile. This is one of the hopes that we have as we start to look at where there are opportunities. This was a very clear and easy one. The other thing in terms of our long-term goal was looking at staff training and building the field on the value of knowing who we're investing in. This is incredibly important, especially in a state as diverse as California. And then additionally, we wanted to look at opportunities where we could provide capacity or technical assistance in order to help address those barriers and challenges that were raised by applicants, because we have a strong desire that if there is interest, that we want to be able to support it on an ongoing basis, not just to satisfy our own data needs. And hopefully the biggest lesson for TCE wasn't about the data that we were collecting, but rather the opportunity to ignite the conversations about DEI where they haven't existed before. And with that, I will send it back to Gabe. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much, Dolores and Amanda and Kelly. That was excellent all around. We have one question here kind of as a group of panelists for the three of you to dive into a bit, and then we've had a bunch of great questions come in through that questions pane on GoToWebinar. Before we get to the panelist question, if anybody else has questions in the audience, now would be a great time to enter those into the questions pane. But while we wait for more questions to come in, the question that we want to start off the discussion with is, if all foundations collect diversity data from grantees in a methodical way, how might this impact grant making for the better? And Dolores, I'm wondering if you could start us off.
Certainly, thanks, Gabe. That's a great question, and I think, you know, one of the fundamental pieces that I've learned over the course of our journey here is, in getting to the data, you really need to start with the foundation of that authorizing environment within your own space. Once you have that, I think what it really does, it gives you the opportunity to have conversations that maybe you haven't had in the past. I would say for us, having an equity and inclusion work group within our programmatic team is one piece of it, but it has allowed us to develop tools and articulate the need for resources to help improve our grant making. And I think that the equity and inclusion tool that I shared with you, that is a first step on looking at the decision-making process as it relates to grant making, and really enforcing not the individual grant, but the strategy behind grant making is infused with DEI.
And can I also jump in, Gabe, to say, as I mentioned, what the insight from the peak research and other conversations is that this is really actual critical critical information for impact. I mean, absolutely the goals around diversity and inclusion and representation are extremely critical, and what's important is that so many more foundations are having those conversations. But what we learned was that this, issues around demographics are critical for every field, in the private sector, in the public sector. Everyone collects this data because they need to understand the world in which they're moving in. And so I think for the philanthropic community and the social sector, not having this kind of demographic information in a standard, routine way, allowing for nuances and geography and impact is really operating in the blind, as I often say. Is because if you don't know who you're impacting, then you really, in a clear way, then you really don't know if you're making an impact. And I think a lot of folks sort of said, we were guessing, or we were assuming that we knew, or we were looking at people in other categorical areas. And we know that demographics change rapidly. Things change at communities. And so if you're not actually engaging it on a regular basis, then you really can't be sure that your grant dollars are making optimal impact. And so I think from a field-wide perspective, whether you're part of the diversity and inclusion conversation or not, if you don't have this data, you really don't have essential information. And I would argue it's as essential as their financials, it's essential as their outcomes, it's as essential as how their board is structured. This is really just critical information for impact.
Great, and I'll jump in there as well because I just totally agree. My role at the foundation is within nonprofit effectiveness, and it's a very unique kind of team wherein our mission is to ensure that the local nonprofit sector improves and has the resources it needs, regardless of whether the nonprofits are our grantees or if they're out of our catchment area. We're really just looking at improving the sector. And for us, having this information improves grant making, it improves programming by emphasizing collectively that this is important information to have for the benefit of our nonprofits and for those that they serve. I think that kind of collective voice will go a lot further. And not only that, but I'm a big believer, and we are a big believer, that if we're asking information of our nonprofits or of our grantees, that we're providing them with the resources to do that. So in the field of collecting data, we not only want to be able to ask it of our grantees, but figure out what are the challenges that they're facing in order to collect that and provide them with that resource as well. And when we can do that collectively with other funders or other foundations locally, I just think the impact is that much greater.
Great, thank you all. And Amanda, that's just a perfect segue into one of the questions that we got. And so I'm going to jump right over to that. And I'll just note, we're getting just tons of questions come in right now. So thank you, everybody. We'll get to as many as we can on today's, the last 8 or so minutes that we have today, and then we'll follow up via email and blog post with others. But Laura asked a question that really gets to the heart of what you were just saying, Amanda. She says, for those that collect data on beneficiaries, how do you collect it without putting an undue burden on grantees? Do you give grantees additional funds to cover the cost of the collection? Amanda, is that something that you could talk about? And then Dolores, maybe chime in as well?
Sure. Currently, it's part of our grant applications, and we do make it, it's a very, very quick process in terms of literally just numbers of filling things in. That is something that we are trying to improve upon right now, though. So we are right now engaging with a number of bigger projects that are looking into this. So right now, for example, one engagement is working with the YWCA here locally to fund huge cohorts of nonprofits that can kind of implement this internally as part of their own work. And so this is, again, the very beginning of it, but that is something we certainly want to look to moving forward. Just in the same way that we think about program evaluation or other things that are capacity building and really important and core for our nonprofits to be able to do their work, we certainly believe that we need to also provide them with the resources to do that.
Great. Dolores, how about you?
Yeah, no, I agree with Amanda. And as you saw in my last slide, really one of the goals is really to be able to explore what kind of capacity building technical assistance supports we could provide, because we already have, by definition of our initiative, we are by invitation only. And so we really deal with the same nonprofits for the most part. And the opportunity to be able to provide them some resources for those that, again, those that are interested, where their boards have had this conversation and they're really interested in being able to collect that information, I think it is important for us to look at those as opportunities to help them grow, but also to be able to grow the field. Because again, fundamentally, this may be primarily a conversation that happens because of the culture and society that we're in, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the resources are available at the nonprofit level to be able to do it. So before you can start collecting data or asking for data, you really have to see what fundamentally do they have, where do they want to go, and how can we as a funder support them in doing so.
Great, that makes a ton of sense to me. Kelly, I'm curious, we got a couple of questions, one from Bob and one from Elizabeth, that relate to collecting this information for international grantees, and if there's any guidance that we could provide. With your work with D5, is that something that you all have looked into?
Actually, you know, that's an excellent question, and that's not it's not a trivial issue for a lot of foundations and nonprofits. And our focus was really on the United States, on U.S. Sort of parameters and constraints. But we do know that the Foundation Center, and I believe to some degree GuideStar, but certainly the Foundation Center is really, I think, sort of building some capacity to do this on an international level. But I do think that it's important that folks understand that when you're talking about communities around the world, there's not a one-size-fits-all approach, and that we should not ever assume that our parameters of demographics are, particularly around race and ethnicity, or even sexual orientation, are the same or should be applied in other places. But having said that, it's important for it to still build the muscle among program officers and international nonprofits to understand what are the relevant parameters of diversity and inclusion and demographics and wherever they're funding, and to design their own strategies. How that aggregates up into an institution-wide system is another story, and I think that's part of the learning that the field has to do. But I absolutely think that it is an achievable goal if people really sort of lean into understanding these things. I mean, am I feeling like it's like if we can attempt to eliminate poverty, I think we can attempt to figure out a way to do this on a global scale.
Yeah, I like that framing a lot, Kelly. Thank you. We have a question from Darren in Montana, and he asked, is GuideStar considering including more types of diversity data on the nonprofit profiles? And I'll answer that one quickly here. The answer is yes. We are looking at what additional types we want to include, and we're looking at things like age, socioeconomic status, and population served, which, you know, if we reference back to those, the poll questions that we asked, it looks like population served is something that's already being collected by a lot of both the nonprofits and foundations on today's call. So hopefully that will lead to an easy transition there. So next question here, and Amanda and Dolores, I think it would be great for you to chime in on this, but Brittany asked, how do you evaluate DEI data provided by potential grantees when reviewing their proposals for funding? And I thought this was a really great question. We heard a lot today about its importance and how everyone should be doing it, but I think Brittany's question goes just a layer deeper here of how are grantees actually evaluated with this information, or are they evaluated with this information? Dolores, do you want to start us off there?
Certainly. So it is a great question, and I think if you know, one of the lessons learned from our efforts at data collection was really we are not really evaluating it. We're taking sort of that trust that they have created and put together information that is correct and accurate. And again, to the degree that we've been able to offer technical assistance to our grantees or applicants to be able to really understand the data that we're asking, again, it has really been more about creating the conversation and collecting the information and appreciating that effort, really than looking at their demographic data provided and then looking at whether or not the data is correct necessarily. We are just trying to get them to provide it to us. So in many respects, we're not looking at it with that critical eye, though our program officers really have more of a understanding of comparing that data against what they experience with their one-on-ones when they meet the organization. So We're not looking at it critically, we're just looking to get it. And that sounds like it might be oversimplifying the effort, but it really is just getting folks to talk about DEI, much less present it to us, has been really a huge, huge effort.
Great.
And I'll jump.
Perfect. Amanda, yeah, go right ahead.
Sure. Ours is slightly different. So we are collecting the information that I kind of shared earlier, those demographic data on their staff and board members. One newer thing that we've implemented in the last 3 years or so is with some of our grant applications, it's actually an open-ended question, and it's really getting at whether the staff and board leadership represent the population served. And so we're keeping it open-ended right now in terms of how that representation matters. It could be gender, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, disability status, anything like that, veteran status, housing status. So it's actually quite broad, and we're looking at that as just a way to say we know that there are more categories than we can currently represent, and we want to know if you are actively thinking about. So it's, do you currently represent the population that you're serving? And if not, are you actively thinking about it? So just as Dolores shared, it's a lot of a conversation starter. So it gives us the opportunity, if they don't have a plan in place, that is a really easy area where we can chime in and share kind of the challenges and best practices that we've seen in terms of getting those started, and have had a lot of success in that way. So it is a factor. It's not weighted in any particular way in terms of decision making, but we certainly look at it as where are they in terms of figuring this out for their own organization.
Great, thanks, Amanda. And we're pretty much at time. There's one other question that I want to just touch on real quick, and then we'll wrap up, and it's from Teresa, just regarding the legality of collecting this information. Kelly, can you just give a quick response on that? I know that D5 has done some work with some lawyers about this question.
Great. Yeah, I was actually going to try and fit that in because I forgot to mention it earlier. And we did get a lot of that sense of that, the sense that collecting this information is illegal, and we contracted with a law firm to really scan the field and the state of the legal issues around demographic data, and they found that it is not illegal to collect or inquire about demographic information, but it is important to do it in a way that acknowledges that people often don't. Some communities don't have federal anti-discrimination protections, and so how you collect it and how you use it is really important. That brief actually is on the D5 website. If you go to the tab under data, we have a lot of tools there for people to answer some of these questions, and that brief is one of them. I would really point people to it. What it is important just to understand is that it's illegal to require people to provide the information, and so if people under whatever situation don't want to share demographic information among themselves, they don't have to, which is why it's always important to allow an opt-out option in whatever process you use or decline to state, and whatever process you use to collect this information. But asking it is not illegal. What is illegal is to use it to discriminate against people.
Great, thanks, Kelly, and thank you to Amanda, Dolores, and to Kelly for your time today. I thought this was a really engaging conversation, and I learned a lot. I hope our audience did as well. A few things just as we wrap up here. First, we will be sending out a list of resources after this conversation via email. But not only that, we'll send out slides and recordings so that you can access this information after the fact. And then lastly, if you asked a question that we weren't able to get to, which was a lot of questions today, we'll be following up individually with answers so that you can learn more. Again, thanks everybody for joining us for this conversation, and we look forward to continuing it in the near future.